this is really thinking about the philosophy of baby sleep. So we hear so much about sleep training and baby sleep schedules, but what happens if a mom just does not want to do that? Where does she even begin?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying specifically, we become like, I'm going to speak for myself. I'm like a little bit of an A type controlling person. I like to control all the parts of my life. Then we have a baby and we have another human that we're responsible for, and they're different than us. They have a different temperament, they have a different schedule, they have all different things. And one of the things that can be frustrating for parents is that we feel like a schedule is something that we can control, and it becomes a point of fixation for a lot of parents. But the reality is that just like you and I don't sleep the same, it's the same is true for babies. So different babies at 6 months are going to sleep different schedules. They're going to have different wake windows. They're going to have different sleep needs. We look at how much activity they have during the day, their temperament, and again, just sleep needs in 24 hours. So one of the things about schedules specifically, because you brought it up, is that we don't need to have a set schedule. And when our baby was in utero, we just trusted that they were sleeping enough, right? And then they come out and all of a sudden there's all these things to control. But the reality is that babies are all going to be sleeping different times, different amounts. And the best thing to do is just find a rhythm to your day. Maybe, your baby's waking up and they're eating something, and then you're doing a little bit of a play, and then maybe there's some wind down and another feed, and they're going back to sleep for naps, right? Or during the day. But the best thing that we can do is just really be tuning into our own baby's natural rhythm versus trying to force them on a schedule. And so we always worry about, they're going to be overtired if they don't get X amount of hours, right? And we're somehow going to hurt their development if they're not sleeping like the book says they should be sleeping. But I also think for parents, there are parents who find some comfort in a schedule and it works for them, and their baby may be really regimented and routine. Great, go for it. But I always say to parents to just reflect on how it's making you feel. And if it's causing more stress, it's time to let it go. Your baby's going to be completely fine. But if we can tune into our babies and just start observing their tired cues, and then going by their mood versus the clock, these are just really helpful tips. Your baby's going to be just fine if you don't.
This is so interesting to hear. I think trusting that you can just tune into the baby's cues instead of the schedule, that is already groundbreaking. Because we often don't get the type of advice where we are encouraged to just tune into those signs. So we often don't trust ourselves to know, oh, now they're tired.
But if you think about too, like even look at now we've got all these apps to track it. So now all of a sudden we're really not tuning in, right? So we're, every time we see a little bit of tired, I see parents logging it on an app and trying to build this schedule. So what we're doing is we're taking those moments that are really important for mom and baby attunement, and we're using technology to try to figure it out. But the biggest takeaway too is that most of the world doesn't sleep train, and most of the world doesn't follow wake windows and sleep schedules, and their babies are just fine. And I think this is like one of the biggest pieces of advice. When you start to look at sleep around the world and what parents are doing in other countries, if sleep training were necessary or sleep schedules were necessary for babies' development, we would have all kinds of research on certain countries that their babies are more advanced than other babies or other countries, but it's just not the case. So, again, I always say most of the world is not following any of these rules. Most of these rules are very often made up, and most of these rules have a financial benefit for somebody if you follow them, or if you feel like a failure because you're not following them.
So now, let's say a mom leans into this more, let me follow my gut, let me really follow my baby's cues type of sleep. Then how can a parent tell the difference between normal infant wakefulness and a genuine sleep issue that needs attention?
So usually my general rule of thumb is, first of all, baby sleep cycles are short. So they're usually around 45 to 60 minutes. So if your baby, we always get caught up in this idea of we need to teach them how to connect sleep cycles. I hear this all the time with parents. Okay. So if your baby is sleeping 2 hours, they connected a sleep cycle, right? They move from one sleep cycle to the next. Usually, as long as I see one good 2 to 3 hour stretch at night, I would say your baby is probably normal. This is probably pretty typical. Where I often flag it, and the only time, because I think there's also this whole waited out approach where we just don't make any changes and we don't do anything. But very often, the problem with that is that sometimes there are underlying issues. And not necessarily, when you said sleep problems, not necessarily like a sleep disorder per se, but things like issues with feeding that are impacting sleep, gas, discomfort. A big one is low ferritin, which we can talk about at another point. Snoring, mouth breathing. These are all kind of red flags that need to be addressed. And the beautiful thing is that if we look at those hourly wakes, and instead of saying, sorry, that's my point, is if it's hourly, that's when I say to parents, we need to get to the bottom of this. But if we look at those wakes and instead of saying, well, it's a sleep problem and we need to sleep train, we can say, wow, how great is that my little one's sleep is communicating to me that there's something we need to look into a little bit further. And so I would say if your baby's waking every 2 hours, that's pretty typical. That doesn't mean you still can't make changes or do anything if it's not working for you. But I would say if it's hourly, it's something to look into. And especially if it's been going on for longer than 2 to 3 weeks, definitely something to investigate.
Let's talk about that a little bit now. Can you explain as a mom, how would you find out if one of those things would be an issue? Because I know if you consult your pediatrician, they might not be an expert at this. So who can you even ask? How can you figure out if one of those things is an issue for your baby?
Well, it really depends on what it is. And this comes back to tuning into your instincts, which, our intuition as moms, we just know, right? I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a mom and she says, something's not right. I don't know what it is, but something's not right. And so this is where it's really important to find a trusted practitioner who will listen. Whenever we've got things like snoring or mouth breathing, we need to be finding somebody who's an airway health expert who can look into what exactly might be going on, because that in itself is going to impact sleep. So if we have snoring or mouth breathing, an airway health specialist, an ENT, ear, nose, and throat is great. Sometimes pediatric dentists who specialize in airway health are great. Sometimes you can get a sleep study done depending on where you live. So those are all things to look into, and they need to be addressed. If we have things like low ferritin is a big one that I talk about all the time because it has such an impact on sleep. But the big one there is if, baby's sleep is really restless and they're waking hourly, and it's normal for babies to move around a lot in sleep, so I don't want people to panic. But if you have ever had low ferritin in pregnancy, that's the biggest red flag for me. And especially if you didn't do delayed cord clamping. So those two combined, that's something you're going to want to look into. Sometimes in some countries, pediatricians will check it. Sometimes they will not. So this is something where if you have a naturopathic doctor or somebody like that, very often they'll run the blood work for ferritin. And then also there's things like, I always say to parents, they say, my baby has really bad eczema. I don't know why they're not sleeping. And you have to put it back to say, well, if you did, you wouldn't be sleeping. Or my baby's teething. I don't know why they're not sleeping. Well, for the same reasons that you wouldn't be sleeping if you had pain in your mouth. So these are things where if they're gassy, if I meet a family where baby's really gassy, I almost always send them to a lactation consultant, whether they're breast or bottle fed. Just have a look at how my baby's drinking, see if there's anything that we can do or adjust or any reason that they're gassy. But ultimately, I think we know, right? Like moms know something is wrong. My baby seems uncomfortable. They're difficult to settle. Those are times when you just have to keep pushing and get louder and louder and louder, because otherwise the response is going to be, it's because you didn't sleep train. If you just sleep train, they'll sleep longer stretches. Hourly wakes, almost always there's an underlying reason, and you need to get to the bottom of it.